Thanks, Corla. Minister, I think that the Irish state has never really embraced a full role with regard to the question of housing. Instead, what we've seen successive governments do really is to allow the private sector have free rein in this area, even to the extent of selling off, in some instances, social housing schemes to occupiers rather than looking and introducing schemes as they did in Europe in terms of longer-term rental schemes and so on. And we do have the examples of other European countries which did heavily invest in social housing, the likes of Britain, the likes of Holland, over decades, and as a result now these countries have actually quite a high level of standardised socialised housing stock, although I'd have to say that too is being eroded at the moment in the neoliberal march across Europe that we're seeing everywhere. But I think Ireland always had a low level and a poor approach to social housing, and that is why now we're paying maybe a higher prices than some of the other countries. And I think we have to call it what it is, and it is a crisis, and it is because we do not have a sufficient stock of social housing, and the Minister's attempts to address that are really minuscule in the extent of the overall problem that is there. Other deputies have referred to the huge numbers who are on the waiting lists, figures which have tripled over the last number of years. We should note that those waiting lists have happened at the same time as we had the housing boom, and we should remember RTE used to dedicate whole programmes to encouraging young people to buy property, get on the housing ladder, scrimp and save and take out 100% mortgages. And now we have the irony that some of the people who did purchase those properties in a massive panic, thinking that they'd never ever get a roof over their head if they didn't, have found that they bought properties, maybe a 2-bed in an area which they wanted it to be, a starter home, or a 1-bed. They've got married, they've had children now, and they're stuck there. They can't get rid of it. And in many instances, they've actually had to go and rent somewhere else themselves while they rent out that property, which is too small for their needs. And the only basis that they have become a landlord is that the house that they bought as their home, they simply cannot afford to live in because it doesn't meet their needs. And we do have a complicated situation arising out of that mess, if you like, which took place at that time. Now, I know other deputies have spent their time talking about some of the tragic cases that come to all of our doorsteps now, but we have to recognise that there has been a huge change in this over the last period. What was initially a trickle has become a bit of an avalanche now at this stage. There isn't a day goes by without some horrendous case landing on every deputy's doorstep here, I firmly believe, and we have to respond swiftly, and I don't think it is being done enough. I'm not going to give all my time over to this situation, but the deputies know, I mean, huge numbers of people on waiting lists for years. The fact that we have to tell people now, sure, you're only on the list for 5 years, you haven't a hope in hell of getting a house maybe for another 5 years, sort of tells its own story. And again, it's not that the state isn't spending money on housing, the state is spending a massive amount of money on housing, but again, it is going to the private sector, and that is not good. And it's not regulated sufficiently either. I mean, we did a search on daft.ie yesterday, which looked at properties for rent in Swords, where I live, and there were 37 properties for rent. 31 of those offers stipulated no rent supplement accepted, and this is becoming an absolute hallmark of our housing situation. And it's not really good enough, because the government has been kind of, as previous governments, prepared to abdicate responsibility of housing to private landlords, and then they're free to discriminate as they see fit, which is simply unacceptable in a modern society, as if being in receipt of a social welfare payment is some sort of a character flaw, when in reality it is a flaw of our economic system which absolutely needs to be addressed. I really don't think that it is good enough at all that this situation is being allowed to prevail. Now, obviously, people know Threshold carried out a survey which showed that more than 50% of people receiving rent supplement from the state are topping up those payments. Now, fair play, Threshold are a great organisation. They do good research, but we all know that that's true. I'm surprised it's that low, because in my experience, nearly everybody that I deal with is paying over the odds and is topping up their rent, because the rent supplement being levied or allowed by the state is simply not anywhere near enough for the market rents that landlords are getting out there. Now, I appreciate what has been said before, oh, we don't want to be contributing to driving up rents. But the reality is that the only consequence of the way in which the government is dealing with this is it's driving people into homelessness, it's driving them into hostels, which are an incredible nightmare for families to be in. I mean, we had people only there a while ago who had been on the council housing list for 5 years. There was a change in the ownership of the property. This couple, one of whom was working, and their 3 children had nowhere else to go. They were moved from North County Dublin into a hostel on the south side of the city. Every morning, get the kids up to school to bring them to school in Swords. Patrick's Day weekend, hotel was already pre-booked, as a hotel would be for tourists. The family had to get out and go somewhere else. And these stories are being replicated all over the place. And the state is spending a huge amount of money on this. So driving people into a scenario like that, which is expensive for the state and not good for those families, is absolutely madness. And the other place people are being driven is out of the areas where they live, where their children are in school, and say, well, you'll have to move somewhere else where the rents are cheaper. We have to deal with this issue. Now, I know that the Minister has said recently that the rental market in Ireland should be regulated along the lines of what happens in other European countries, and suggested that the price of rented accommodation should be capped in line with the cost of living, which would be of some benefit in the short term. But to be honest, we need a much more longer-term solution, which has to involve providing more housing stock. Now, that does mean construction, which is not in the right places where there is a need, is absolutely necessary. I think myself that pool of properties which are currently owned by what I call reluctant landlords, those who bought the property as a home and are only keeping it as a rented property in order to be able to pay the bank back some contribution for it. They would happily give the keys back if they thought they weren't being left with a debt. I think the state needs to evaluate how many of those properties there are, and could a collective scheme be undertaken there where those properties would be taken into the ownership of the state. Let's remember, a lot of the banks are in our ownership, and a lot of the rent that's been paid on those properties is being paid through rent supplement to people who don't want to be landlords in the first place. So I think we need to be creative and to look at that whole area as well. I think, you know, the issue of rent controls absolutely has to be considered in this scenario as well, so that at least rents are affordable for everybody. And, you know, plenty of examples have been given about the experience in other countries. I think countries like Germany are particularly good, where rents have been regulated since the early 1970s, where the German rent index takes in a lot of different very good factors: the age and condition of the building, the quality of the facilities and the locality, and the tenant has much better rights than they would have here. And as a result, rents in Germany increase slower than anywhere else in Europe. They have a very much a rent-oriented real estate market, which makes it very easy for people to get rented properties, and obviously only 43% of German people own their own homes, the lowest in Europe, because the rental market is so attractive, so secure in terms of its tenure, and the rents themselves regulated and controlled. We have to move in that direction if we are to deal with the horrific cases that are out there. It is simply unacceptable in this day and age that families are being driven out of the communities that they live in, that they're being put in inadequate temporary accommodation, and are dealing with the stress and heartache that so many people are. I mean, it is the cause of it's just so many problems now, and it's not good enough for the government to say, oh, we're trying, or it was a crisis caused by Fianna Fáil. That's old news now. Things have deteriorated substantially within the last 3 years in the lifetime of this government, and while some measures are welcome, they are, I would say, way too little, far too late, and not in any way substantial enough to address the housing crisis. We need new start-up bills, we need rent controls and regulation, but we also need to deal with the mortgage crisis, which also is contributing and driving more people into the social housing need bracket without the housing stock being there to address it.